Imagine you're pulling on a monetary thread that stretches back more than 200 years. At one end are chests of silver draining away after the Opium Wars, mares of bullion flowing out of China to pay for an addictive import from the West. At the other end, right now, are strings of binary code in digital wallets, the Digital Yuan, the e-CNY moving across borders in seconds, flowing through payment systems that Washington doesn't fully control. Same country, same story of money. But the roles have flipped, from being a victim of financial weapons to learning how to turn money itself into a tool of power. That's the journey we're taking today, from Opium Silver to Digital Yuan, how China turned money into a weapon. From Opium Silver to the Digital Yuan, how China has tried to transform its currency into a geo-economic weapon. We start in the 19th century. Qing-era China didn't see money as a weapon. It saw it as part of the natural order. The Chinese Empire had existed for thousands of years, using silver as its standard. Silver was the unit of account, the basis of tax, the medium of wages, the thing that lived in the collective imagination as real value. But outside, the world was changing. Britain, America, and Europe were gradually shifting to the gold standard, then toward an industrialized, bank-driven financial system. They weren't just trading goods. They were trading money, credit, and risk. When British merchants discovered that the Chinese were addicted to tea, but uninterested in Western industrial products, a one-way trade began. Silver flowed from Britain into China in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. For London, this was a leak of precious metal that was hard to accept. They needed to reverse the flow of silver. The answer? Opium, a cheap product to grow in India, highly profitable, addictive, and sold into China for Chinese silver. The silver started flowing the other way, back into British hands. When the Qing court tried to ban opium, it wasn't just about morality or social order. It was a desperate attempt to protect the silver-based monetary system from a disguised financial attack. And we know how that ended. The Opium Wars, unequal treaties, forced opening of ports, imposed tariffs, and, more importantly, silver flows increasingly controlled by foreign trade under rules written by Western powers. Within a few decades, China went from center of the world to a semi-colonial economy, being drained through payment channels it didn't control. Money, which had once been the foundation of domestic order, became a pipeline through which internal power was eroded. For the Chinese, the 19th century wasn't just a century of humiliation. It was the most vivid possible lesson in monetary weaponization. When someone else controls the flow of silver, gold, and credit, they don't need to occupy your capital. They just need to make your government unable to pay. Moving into the 20th century, the monetary wounds deepened. The fall of the Qing dynasty, warlordism, the Sino-Japanese War, World War II, hyperinflation under the Republic of China. Together, they created a shared experience. Whoever controls money, controls reality. Banknotes lost value so fast that people had to bring sacks of cash just to buy basic goods. Multiple currencies circulated at once. Nationalist notes, warlord notes, Japanese occupation money, military scrip. Each piece of paper was a promise, and most of those promises were broken. When the Chinese Communist Party seized power in 1949, one of its top priorities was to restore monetary order. It's no coincidence that in the early years, the fight against hyperinflation and the unification of currency were strategic priorities. The new renminbi wasn't just money. It was a symbol of power and sovereignty. It said, this state can control prices, food, and taxes. But in the first decades of communist rule, China didn't use money as an external weapon. It used it as an internal management tool. Central planning, ration coupons, state-set prices, and a relatively closed economy. In the context of the Cold War, China was mostly an observer of the global financial system, not a key player. So where does the turning point come from? The turning point comes in the late 20th century, when China starts opening up, reforming, and trying to reclaim a place in global trade. From the 1980s onward, China reforms agriculture and industry, opens special economic zones, attracts FDI, joins global supply chains, and becomes the world's factory. In that process, money changes roles again. This time, China chooses a very different strategy from the Qing era. Instead of letting foreign merchants dictate the rules, China agrees to play by the rules, but with a long-term goal of rewriting part of them. Look at the trade balance. Goods made in Guangdong, Zhejiang, Jiangsu are exported all over the world. Chinese firms earn US dollars, not silver or gold. The dollar becomes the blood of global trade, and China quickly becomes one of the largest holders of dollars on Earth. What do they do with those dollars? Some are used to import raw materials, technology, and machinery. A large chunk is turned into foreign exchange reserves, especially U.S. Treasury bonds. In other words, China parks its savings inside the financial system of the very country that is also its main strategic rival. It sounds paradoxical, but that's the logic of globalization. China exports cheap goods to the U.S. and earns dollars. America prints dollars and sells treasuries. China buys treasuries and finances U.S. consumption. This loop runs for years, creating what some economists call Chimerica, a U.S.-China financial chimera. At the same time, China quietly draws a lesson. The dollar is both foundation and vulnerability. Whoever controls the dollar system, sanctions, SWIFT, and asset freezes, holds an incredibly powerful weapon. No bullets, no warships needed. A single order can freeze a country's reserves, choke its banking system, and cripple its trade. China has watched this play out in sanctions against Iran, Russia, and others. It understands very clearly, if it doesn't reduce its dependence on the dollar, China will always have a throat someone else can grab. From here, the story shifts from China using finance to join the system toward China using money to reduce vulnerability and expand influence. The first step in weaponizing money isn't attacking others. It's self-defense. China's first line of defense was to build enormous foreign exchange reserves, over $3 trillion at one point. With that stockpile, Beijing wants to ensure it never ends up like Asian countries in 1997. Thin reserves, speculative attacks, forced to turn to the IMF and swallow harsh conditions. Big reserves are armor, but that armor is made mostly of dollars. And dollars live in a financial system where the US, its allies, and global institutions hold a lot of power. So the second step has to be diversification. More gold, more non-dollar currencies, bilateral currency swaps with other central banks, and promoting the use of the renminbi CNY in trade. China gradually builds swap lines with many countries. If needed, they can exchange local currency and CNY directly without going through the dollar. Then comes the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. China lends and invests in infrastructure across dozens of emerging economies. A lot of that lending is still dollar-denominated, but more and more transactions are nudged into CNY. Next, China builds CIPS, its own cross-border interbank payment system, as an alternative or complement to SWIFT for renminbi transactions. This is obscure plumbing that few outsiders pay attention to, but it's crucial infrastructure for any future attempt at monetary weaponization. Without your own pipelines, you can't send your financial weapons anywhere. In parallel, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen are developed as regional financial centers for offshore renminbi, CNY bond issuance, and derivatives and commodity contracts settled in CNY. But that still doesn't make money a weapon. Money only becomes a weapon when it's used to exert pressure, build dependence, or create strategic leverage, not just to settle trades. That's where the Digital Yuan e-CNY comes in as a new puzzle piece. The Digital Yuan isn't just a digital version of cash. If it were just money in an app, the world has had that for years. E-wallets, mobile banking, cards. The power of e-CNY is that it is central bank money in digital form, programmable, trackable in fine detail, and integrable into cross-border payment systems without going through traditional commercial bank layers. For China, e-CNY serves multiple goals at once. Domestically, it's a tool to make payments more efficient, fight tax evasion, expand financial inclusion, and, undeniably, increase micro-level visibility into economic activity. The state can see money flows almost in real time. Outside its borders, the digital yuan is a golden opportunity to reduce the dollar's role in bilateral trade, especially with countries that already trade and borrow heavily with Beijing. Imagine a country involved in BRI, borrowing from Chinese banks to build roads, ports, power plants. Today, many of those loans are still dollar-denominated and settled via traditional systems. But what happens if a portion of those payments shifts to e-CNY, settled through a platform controlled by China? First, that country will need to hold e-CNY as a settlement asset. Second, it becomes dependent on digital infrastructure designed, operated, and updated by Beijing. Third, because the transactions don't pass through New York or London, the reach of U.S. and allied financial sanctions is weakened. In other words, if Qing-era China was forced to open ports, accept treaty terms, and watch silver bleed out, modern China is trying to build new financial ports in the form of payment systems, contracts, and technical standards, where other countries are the ones playing by Chinese rules. This is the core of China's version of monetary weaponization. Not loud boycotts or embargoes, but creating a reality in which your money, your debt, your projects, and your payments are tightly tied to the renminbi and infrastructure China controls. Once that dependency is deep enough, money stops being just a medium of exchange. It becomes leverage. But the story is never one-sided. Money is a double-edged weapon. Every step China takes involves real risk. First, trust. For a currency to be an effective weapon, it first has to be a trusted asset. If partners believe the rules can change arbitrarily, that contracts can be politicized, or that data can be misused, they'll hesitate to step too far into that ecosystem. Second, convertibility. The renminbi is still under relatively tight capital controls. China wants to use CNY to expand influence, but fears that fully open capital flows could destabilize its domestic economy. This is a real dilemma. To gain power, you must open up. But opening up risks losing control. Third, reaction from the old system. Every step the CNY takes, every new payment platform, every oil, gas, or metal contract priced in renminbi doesn't occur in a vacuum. Other powers, the US, EU, Japan, India, major democracies, also see, measure, and strategize. They respond with their own moves. New payment alliances, strengthening the dollar, euro, or yen, tighter controls over tech and data, and so on. In short, turning money into a weapon isn't like picking up a gun. It is more like building a web of financial dependencies, where each strand is both an economic opportunity and a political tie. So why does China continue down this path, despite all the risks? The answer goes back to historical memory. A country that was forced to sign unequal treaties, had to pay war indemnities in silver, saw its currency debased, lived through hyperinflation, and watched the power of modern financial sanctions. Cannot look at money as neutral. In that worldview, leaving your monetary fate entirely in someone else's system is slow suicide. To be safe, you need options. To have options, you need your own ecosystem. And once that ecosystem is big enough, it doesn't just protect you. It gives you leverage. From Opium Silver, where monetary flows were controlled by foreigners, to the Digital Yuan, where China dreams of payment systems, where it holds the switch. The arc is long, but the underlying logic is remarkably consistent. Whoever controls money defines risk. Whoever doesn't lives inside risks defined by others. If we zoom out beyond China, this story carries another message for every country and for each of us as individuals. In a world where money itself can be weaponized, understanding financial history becomes a survival skill. You can't control the CNY, the USD, the euro, or the digital yuan. But you can understand why countries fear being cut off from the dollar system, why they accept using the renminbi even while worrying about it, why blockchain, CBDCs, and new payment rails keep appearing, why every crisis is used as an excuse to upgrade the monetary system. And most importantly, you can see that money has never been politically neutral. It has always been about power, sometimes expressed through warships, sometimes through interest rates, and sometimes through the source code of a payment platform. From Opium Silver to Digital Yuan, China has moved from being forced to play a game designed by others to trying to design part of a new game. This process is far from complete, and its eventual outcome is still uncertain. But one thing is clear. Those silver chests that once flowed out of Guangzhou, Xiamen, and Shanghai in the 19th century are not just a closed chapter. They became a strategic trauma, encoded into a 21st century question. This time, who will control whose money? That's the moment when money stops being paper, stops being numbers on a screen, and becomes a silent weapon, one that doesn't explode, but can change the path of an entire nation.